turnout for a great speaker. This is our annual Dorson Memorial Lecture. Exciting stuff, something we planned years in advance. I'm so glad to see everyone here. I'm going to just quickly turn things over to Dr. Ray Cashman, Director of the Folklore Institute, who will introduce our speaker. But we've got a lot of really great things coming in terms of departmental events. Take a look at our weekly email. It gets sent out. And I will have some very important news coming out very shortly about our department. But in the meantime, I'm very excited about this talk. So without further ado, Dr. Ray Cashman.
Thank you very much. Welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Ray, and I'm here to welcome you to the 2019 annual Dorson Memorial Lecture, hosted by, of course, the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. And I want to start with just a quick word about the nature of the lecture series. This is our big scholarly event of the year. This is named after, in honor of, in memory of Richard Mercer Dorson, who was the first director of the Folklore Institute here starting in 1956, and later the first chair of the Department of Folklore. And what this lecture series allows us to do is bring in somebody, a star in the broad field of folklore studies from outside of campus to Bloomington. And this year we are absolutely delighted to have Tom Mould, Professor Thomas Cleveland Mould. From Elon University in North Carolina. Now, many of you know that Tom earned his MA and PhD in folklore here at IU. That was after a BA in English at Washington University. And here at IU, during the golden Gen X 90s, Tom slaved away at many jobs. He was an AI like many of you have been here. He served his time in the bowels of the Mathers Museum, the IU Art Museum, slaving away at Trickster Press and Traditional Arts Indiana. All of these experience-rich, character-building jobs that he translated first into a short lecturing stint in anthropology at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And not long after that, he joined Elon University, I think it was 2001, first in English, then in anthropology. We, scholars of vernacular expressive culture, know how to straddle. Yep. At Elon, over time, Tom has directed the honors program, the program in ethnographic research and cultural studies. Almost Perks is what it's called. And he's currently chair of anthropology and sociology. And in 2013, this was a really big kudo to Tom, he was appointed the, I'm going to get this right, J. Earl Daniel Lee Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Folklore. And I am super excited to say on a personal note, I'm very excited that Tom will be starting a new position in fall 2019, closer to us, in the Department of History and Anthropology at Butler University in Indianapolis, just up the road. So take note, students, he is an absolutely fantastic resource. Take note, Tom. We will use you like a rented mule if you're not careful. Maybe not so many yeses in the first year, but let me back up and just recount some of Tom's many works and miracles. So generally speaking, Tom's research revolves around, well, certainly oral narrative, but with a particular attention to elements of performance, the boundaries and uses of genre, constructed identities, and I would say something like the poetics and politics of discourse. Now, what does that look like in terms of product? Well, Tom is the author of 3 books. The first, Choctaw Prophecy, a legacy, of the future, 2003. Choctaw Tales, 2004, I understand there's an updated edition in the works. And those of you who have taken my 516 seminar would have read, or at least been assigned, Still the Small Voice, Revelation, Personal Narrative, and the Mormon Folk Tradition, 2016. Now, his current book project tentatively entitled Overthrowing the Queen, Telling Stories About Welfare in America. It's due out from Indiana University Press very soon. This, of course, is the project he'll be previewing tonight, but I'm not quite done with the works in there. So, what else? In addition to these monographs, Tom has co-edited 2 more books. The Individual and Tradition, Folkloristic Perspectives, 2011, co-edited with myself and Pravina, who's here somewhere, yes. And also Latter-day Mormon Folklore Studies, 2013, with Eric Eliason. Tom's also served as a guest editor of 2 special journal issues, one on fake news for the Journal of American Folklore, 2018, and another one co-edited with Lynn Huber, forthcoming from Cross Currents, entitled On the Edge of Apocalypse. Now, in addition to publishing widely in academic and popular sources, Tom has produced several ethnographic videos, a 7-part series on Indiana folklife, 4 on Kentucky folk arts, a documentary on kiln openings in North Carolina. His public folklore projects have included a permanent museum exhibit at the Mebane Historical Museum, fieldwork training and documentation at the Choctaw Tribal Archives, and his Voices of Welfare project, on which this book is based, with 8 local community partners in North Carolina. Now, we're particularly lucky to have Tom here tonight because he's going to be here all next week doing double duty as a newly elected member of the Executive Board of the American Folklore Society, which is having its board meeting next week. So, that reminds me of one more thing. Tom has graciously offered to meet with graduate students on Wednesday from 1:30 to 3:30 for a workshop on working with big data, or biggish data, as he'll explain, but basically giving advice to people who are working with lots and lots of texts. How do you manage them? How do you tack back and forth between the macro and the micro in your analysis? These sorts of things. So that's on Wednesday. Do send your RSVPs in to Tabitha so that we can order the right amount of pizza. So, enough of all that. On with the matter at hand. Please help me welcome Tom Mould back to.
So I'm so sad my mom couldn't have heard that. That was everything I've ever done. There's nothing left. But thank you, that was very kind. And what a great homecoming. It's just awesome to see so many faces of my time here and, of course, our time at AFS and its folklore together. So thanks for coming out. Hopefully I won't put you to sleep. As Ray said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on since 2012, 13, about there. So a little while. And it's part of, as Ray said, it's part of a collaborative research project. Those are some of the community partners that I was working with. Unfortunately, Caroline Miller is, I think she's doing field work, or she's at a wedding, I can't remember, something important this weekend. We'll have her back on Wednesday, but she was, as an Elon student, part of this project. So it involved multiple faculty, it involved multiple students, lots of community partners. It was a big project. It had 10 major sort of outcomes. We accomplished them all, plus a couple of additional ones. The last one to sort of check off is the book, and as Ray said, that one's coming. So happily, we're moving along. I want to ask a question, and this is one of them, which is pretty basic, and it's been asked at least since Martin Gillen's in the 1990s. Why do so many Americans hate welfare? Lots of scholars have weighed in. They got some great answers. We'll look at kind of a summary of what some of those answers have been. I think that there are a couple missing pieces. And spoiler alert, I think it's that we haven't paid enough attention to narrative. I know that comes as a big surprise. And in fact, this quote probably says it all, right? Because I study narrative, of course that's the missing gap. And yeah, maybe a little bit of a left-wing sorehead too. So I do think there's some data to back up the idea that narrative actually is a sort of missing link in our understanding about why so many of us demonize both welfare as a public assistance program and welfare recipients as individual people. So that's one question. There's 2 others I want to ask. This one is not going to be a big surprise. We sort of cycle back to this question from time to time. Many of us in this room have answered this in various ways. So the idea that genre might be ideologically predisposed towards particular ideologies. And so specifically, I'm asking, is it possible that welfare stories are really this sort of cards are stacked against people who are trying to tell narratives at all about public assistance? Is it really, really hard to get out from under that ideology and actually share stories that might in fact not demonize the poor? The answer, I'm afraid, is yes, but I don't think all is lost, which is part 3. Is there anything we can do about it? And so in the last part of the talk, I want to shift and put on a hat, an activist hat, and talk about what we as folklorists might do when we find social injustice, etc., in the field work that we do. I actually just barreled right in and forgot to thank all the folks. I just sort of realized, like, yeah, there's people behind it. So Michelle and Tabitha are maybe here somewhere, but there's Tabitha.
Not here.
She's in for the reception. So, but anyway, they've both done a lot. Thank you for bringing me here. The reason it made me just think that I had forgotten to thank you was I was also going to mention Dorson, also sort of a kind of, I've never met him, I never got a chance, but a thank you to him for having this great opportunity. I think he would maybe like my first 2 areas. I'm not so sure he'd be a fan of the third one. So I hope I'm not sort of offending anything. I'd like to think that he would have, his thought might have changed over the years, and maybe he'd be okay with number 3. So I'm just going to pretend that's the world I live in, and that's going to be part of our talk. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into stories, and I know you all know this story, and many of you will have heard the second one too, but I want to give 2. It's just a kind of a grounding or a foundation for my talk. So I'll read verbatim the kind of classic version of Reagan's welfare queen story. So in 1976 is when he starts kind of peddling this story. It's when he's running for the Republican nomination against Gerald Ford. He loses, Ford wins, but Reagan, of course, is back 4 years later and does win. This narrative puts him on the map. She has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, and is collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. And she's collecting Social Security on her cards. She's got Medicaid, getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income alone is over $150,000. So that's story number 1. We can unpack that story a little bit. A lot of people have sort of said, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Unfortunately, that story is probably pretty darn true. This is based on Linda Taylor. She was, by all accounts, a really despicable person. Maybe murdered people, definitely kidnapped children, definitely abused them. The problem is, that's not the face of welfare, right? But Reagan made it so. And so that story stuck, and that's what we're living with. So flash forward to 2011. I'm at a cocktail party. We're raising money for Elon, and there's some fairly wealthy donors. Phyllis Schlafly is not one of the people there. But the ideology kind of fits, so that's why you're looking at her face. And I'll go ahead and give this caveat. This is a project that it's not one that I can put up the faces of all the folks that I've worked with. The folks who are telling stories, often legends about aid recipients, often spoke because they weren't going to have their names used. Many of the aid recipients that we worked with about 80, also were hesitant to have their face become the next face of public assistance. So I default to Phyllis Schlafly. But we'll talk about their stories, and we'll remember that there are very real individuals behind them. Okay. Oh, I didn't tell you her story. I'm going to read this one too. So at the party, it's one of these things, we do this as folklorists. It's not ideal, but somebody tells us a story and we're like, oh my gosh, I have to go to the bathroom, I'll be right back. And then we run to the bathroom and we scribble down like this, well. So that's what this is. So we're talking about ACA, Affordable Care Act. We agree on nothing. Until we get to the point where we both agree that maybe the emergency room is not the best place for people to have their sort of primary care. And she says, yes, but, oh, you're so close. Yes, but poor people will still use and abuse the system when they can. I was in the grocery store not too long ago when the woman in front of me tried to buy dog food with her food stamps. You've probably heard a version of this. She was wearing a fur coat, had polished nails, a designer handbag. The checkout girl told her she couldn't do that, and this really made her mad. She huffed and puffed and threw the dog food down and said, fine, then he'll eat steak instead. She marched back to the meat counter while we were all standing there waiting for her. The cashier is looking apologetically at us, and here she comes, sure enough, with 2 steaks. Now, I heard that story when I was growing up, and there was a coda to it, which you probably fill in, which is she then went out to the parking lot and got into a... Yes. That was not part of the story that Phyllis told that night, but all the other sort of classic pieces were there. So those are some of the stories that I think help frame this idea that stories matter in how we perceive welfare. This is a very summarized kind of version of literally hundreds of studies about sort of answering this question from psychological, sociological, political, and rhetorical analysis. I won't unpack all of them, but Martin Gillen's work in particular, where he's looking at the mass media's role, that's a big piece of it, and found that African Americans were presented something like 75% of the time compared to white Americans as aid recipients, and so that shaped how we view public assistance. And so racial animus got transferred from those images onto welfare, so racism that was already existing just simply got moved over. And undeserving poor is something we can take all the way back to the poor laws of the 1700s in this country. Definitions of welfare, when you ask people what welfare is, there's wide variance on what's included. And most people only think of sort of the check and food stamps, but there's a whole series of other programs that people made themselves be participating in, but that's not welfare. And then values, these, across the board, we're either demonizing people or the system. So the system is unfair, the people are immoral. And then the system creates dependency and destroys the human spirit. And even FDR, right, who we credit with really creating a kind of the welfare state, but in a positive way, still was very adamant that he worried that welfare and these public assistance programs were going to destroy the human spirit. Hence, a lot of the CCC and other programs that were developed. The question, though, I have is, but how? How did we get to this point? Where did these ideas come from, and how do they continue to sort of emerge and get shared? Okay, I do not expect you to unpack this whole thing. So let me just say that in 2004, Anne Marie Hancock asked this question. She said, if we're looking at welfare, how can we understand people's perceptions and this policy? Remember, Bill Clinton signed in 1996 the Personal Responsibility, Work Opportunity, and Responsibility Act, the Welfare Reform Act in 1996. And she wondered, hey, how closely do we align the actual policies, which are across the top, with the stereotypes of the welfare queen down here? And I highlighted anything that had over more than 10 instances of people who were using these arguments in congressional debates. So this chart from her, the highlighting is mine, but she found that there is, for basically every single policy up there, you can ground it in this ideology of the welfare queen that Reagan had been fostering within the political sphere for years and had been picked up and spread widely throughout the US, except for 2. These 2 have almost no interaction. So we think, okay, well, that's not horribly surprising, right? People don't just develop public policy based on a single stereotype. What became interesting, however, was if we stand back and we don't think of the welfare queen as the only narrative out there, and we look at the broader sort of narrative tradition around public assistance, all of a sudden we find exactly where those 2 come in. The number one story, we heard it from Phyllis, is this food stamp reform. It's this idea that people are buying things with their food stamps that they're not supposed to be buying. And that narrative really helps explain, and again, it's correlation, it's not causation, I'm not making that argument, but certainly there's a strong correlation. For Medicaid denial, the other big stereotype around people receiving public assistance is lazy, able-bodied men who should be working and aren't. And often the excuse is they're disabled, they can't work, right? I've got this back problem, I've got this whatever. And so the Medicaid denial perhaps is associated with that body of narrative as well. These are some of the biggest narratives out there being told about welfare. Remember again, these aren't just conservative politicians Bill Clinton signs this into law. Now, we can unpack the politics of that, and we recognize that there was a lot of push from a Republican Congress to make this law, but Clinton campaigned on the idea of ending welfare as we know it, and then took a whole lot of credit for reducing the welfare rolls. The economy did most of that work, and then let's keep in mind that reducing welfare rolls is not the same as getting people out of poverty. It just means they're getting less aid. So that's not really a great measure of success. So, if it's not just the conservatives, who else are telling these stories? I found again and again and again, I'm always hesitant to sort of share this, because then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm never talking to that guy again. I don't use names, but I was talking to some friends. We were at dinner, and Steve is not his real name, and he's a colleague of mine, and we were chatting. It was a mixed group of folks, different ethnic groups, different gender, etc. And we started talking about the research that we were all up to. I mentioned mine, and Steve immediately said, oh my God, that's so important, because the stereotypes are so awful. And then he told 2 stories. The second one was ODB, Old Dirty Bastard, from Wu-Tang Clan, who is sort of a very famous YouTube clip of him going and collecting his welfare check in a big limousine. So that was story number 2. But the first story he told, and I'll read this one to you. This is the last one I do this to you on, but this is another run to the bathroom moment. He said, and we're in a Mexican restaurant, I should add. He said, I used to work in a Mexican restaurant, and these guys would work for a while and then look for ways to be fired. They'd pick fights with the boss, come in late, slack off, be disrespectful, anything to get fired. They knew exactly how long they had to work before they could get fired and go back on unemployment and welfare. They'd work for just long enough. And there was sort of some general commentary like, oh my gosh, oh, that's terrible. I'd be like, why don't y'all work and move up and get better jobs, better paying jobs? And they were like, why, man? I'm done with this bullshit. So I then asked him and said, you know, was this like a lot of guys you were working with or like a couple? And he goes, oh, just a couple. But man, they were done with the system. And they felt had screwed them for so long. They figured no matter how hard they worked, they were never going to get ahead. So, Steve's experience, I don't doubt at all. Again, the problem is he has this sort of ideology that's here that says, yeah, this is a real problem. And yet he spent the bulk of his time on 2 dramatic and very memorable stories that highlighted what he then also sort of agreed were the outliers of this experience. So I want to now walk through then, I think, if we stand back and we think about these narratives as folklorists do, as a genre and as performed, I think there are 4 reasons why they're so negative and why we're in the space that we are, even when it runs counter to what we express as our particular ideologies. I'm going to kind of speed through the first 3 because they're not going to be particularly surprising to you. And I'm going to spend most of my time on number 4. So I'll give you a second just to read those. Oh, I'll read them out. Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Sorry, yes. So one, Baumeister, I'll read his first because that is a study it's a meta-analysis of literally hundreds and hundreds of studies. So this research is really well-founded. But he says, bad impressions and bad stereotypes are quicker to form and more resistant to disconfirmation than good ones. That sort of sets the tone for the idea that the negative is going to stick with us longer. Here, NASA in 2010 actually found in studying the brain that we actually are processing positive and negative information differently. And the way that we process it ends up relating to what, and I'm probably going to mispronounce that, but Tunjan argues in 2012 and found research for that, I'll read this, negative emotions generally involve more thinking, and the information is processed more thoroughly than positive ones. Thus, we tend to ruminate more about unpleasant events and use stronger words to describe them than happy ones. None of this is surprising to the folks that we work with, right? So here are 2 people that I work pretty closely with. One, Susan Osborne, that is her name, director of DSS. She was one of our community partners. Just what stands out in your mind when you've worked with families all day long are the ones that are trying to scam. And then Kate Garnet, and that is not her name, she actually preferred to use a pseudonym, said, have you ever heard the saying that if you're happy with service, you tell 3 to 5 people, if you're unhappy, you tell 20? So again, the folk wisdom is clear here. It does tie into a lot of the work, and memetics is problematic for a number of reasons, but there is some interesting research that has come out of studies in memetic theory, and then something that we might call negative narrative theory. One of the most interesting studies, I think, is one done in 2011 by Chip Heath. You may know this sort of very popular book, Made to Stick. Dan and Chip Heath wrote this together. And chapter 6 is about stories and how stories are sticky. But the whole idea is, what do we remember? And what he found in the study, he asked, what contemporary legends are more likely to be passed on? And what he found was, if it evoked disgust, we were far more likely to share. What he then found out also was that stories that evoked disgust often also evoked anger. They were also, admittedly by the people who were telling them, more negative. A more recent study in 2018 by Vasawi and sort of a whole group of co-authors found that disgust, again, number one, and that also fear and surprise would come along with those stories. Again, it's folklore, so we're not surprised by some of this, particularly because we know that we pass legends not because we believe them necessarily, but because they strike a particular fear or anxiety. It is meaningful to us, and because we sometimes tell them in entertainment and social settings, and we know what makes a good story. What's really interesting, though, I think, is what they found was these stories equated with narratives that the people themselves said were less plausible. So not only did sort of the truth issue not maybe sort of, it didn't kind of matter, but actually people recognized that they were sharing stories that were less plausible. This is really important when we step back and think about what's happening with Facebook right now. Because the algorithm for Facebook says, if you pass it on, we will push it into your Facebook account and onto your screen. And so it's self-fulfilling. You see it, it evokes disgust, you don't believe it. It's a ridiculous story about Pizzagate, for example, but you pass it on, and boom, that algorithm picks it up, and now Pizzagate is just getting shoved into everybody's Facebook account. This is a problem. Supposedly they're working on it. We'll see. All right, that's one. I spent more time on that than I intended. I'll be fast with the next two. The unusual, John Robinson in 1981, I think, sort of says, we don't only share a personal experience, narratives that are unusual. Certainly Sandy could unpack some of this for us as well, but we are often sharing the outlier, right? It's the story. I mean, when we call it news, it's because it's different from, right? So we don't often, in the narrative form, have a way of conveying the habitual. Now, we actually do, I think, the generalized experience narrative. It's something that I think is under-theorized. It's something that Leboff and Walewski actually said is not a narrative at all. I disagree. I'm writing on this topic now. But basically, it's the stories of the habitual action. And I want to actually read to you an example of just how powerful that can be. Maybe, I don't have to read it. I mean, I will read it, but it's on the screen. So, this is one of the DSS workers, Department of Social Services workers that we're talking to. And this is how he starts. He says, I say, tell me about the people that come through the door. Most of the time they come in and you can see that they've had a job, but then they've just lost a job, and now it's all going to shambles and that sort of thing. So that's a generalized experience narrative. This is what typically happens. A more unique story, though, and this is actually recorded, so it's not me running into a bathroom. A more unique story, though, I had a client come in and she had moved here from overseas, and then he proceeds to spend the next 5 minutes telling a pretty dramatic story of a woman who seemed to be committing fraud by getting welfare from different states. He says, this is what's typically happening, but I'm going to talk about this for most of the time that we're together. Okay. Explanation number 3, structural similarity with the American dream. I've talked about this at AFS before. I think it's actually one of the most important kind of conclusions that can honestly come out of this book. But if you align structurally the welfare queen story against the American dream story, they're almost exactly the same. The difference is, you would think, in the ideal world, right, that this one ends in success and this one ends in not success, right? But that's what evokes disgust and frustration and anger among people is, wait a minute, they're getting there too. They're living this life of luxury. And so structurally, this story is hitting at the most foundational narrative of this country. And that's going to make us upset, even if we're not explicitly articulating it. So, here's what I want to spend kind of really the bulk of the rest of the time that we're here together, is on the notion of narrative perspective. And specifically the idea of personal witness narratives. I don't think we've done enough to really distinguish the personal experience narrative from a personal witness narrative, but I think they're really different in important ways. And I think it'll kill two birds with one stone. It'll talk about how genre is perhaps ideologically predisposed towards the negative, but it'll also address this reason of why it is so negative. When I stood back and I took, and I should say this project we recorded. It's tricky because it's sometimes narratives, they're short, long, it's always not always clear sort of where those boundaries are, but probably around 1,200 narratives. Talked to over 150 people. About 80 of them were aid recipients, about 25 of them were aid providers, and about 60 of them were what we might call the general public, people who weren't in the system. They weren't providers or recipients, they were you and me. And of all those stories, the biggest, most important, or the most common stories told about public assistance were shared as personal witness narratives. So let me just kind of return to Reagan for just a moment to ground us in a couple of these stories. So you already know Linda Taylor. We've got her. Reagan was telling other stories at the time, and it got press back at the time. It's not so much today, but if you go back into the 1970s and 80s, these stories were covered pretty heavily. The orange vodka story is maybe it's one of the most common stories that we heard in our collection. Not necessarily always an orange or vodka. The way Reagan told it was, and I should say this, these next two stories, he actually attributes them into the folk tradition. So he says one he heard from a judge friend of his in a social setting, and the second one he heard at a dinner party. So Reagan's not outside the folk tradition. He is operating absolutely within it. He just has a much bigger megaphone. People are paying attention. So this story, it's the guy goes into the store, he grabs an orange, he goes up with and a bottle of vodka, he goes up with his food stamps, he buys the orange that costs 12 cents, gets all the change back from the food stamps, and buys the vodka. Now even then, the most change you could get back from your food stamps was 99 cents. I wasn't living, I was living, I wasn't buying vodka in the 1980s. But I'm pretty sure you couldn't do it with 99 cents, or with 72 cents, depending on how much that orange was. Today, that story is told slightly differently because people have EBT cards, which is like a credit card, and so you don't get any change back. And so now what people will describe is people going and buying their groceries with the EBT card, and then pulling out the little bit of cash they have to buy the lottery tickets, the alcohol, the cigarettes, the dog food. All right. And then, of course, we have the steak story. And he told this one, he's telling this in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s, and I want to get this quote right, this is in the State of the Union address. He says, virtually every American who shops in a local supermarket is aware of the daily abuses that take place in the food stamp program. And he's referencing a narrative that he had told previously about young bucks, which there's been a lot of sort of back and forth, but clearly was dog whistling or racial politic there. The young bucks, he was in the South when he told that story. So he's signaling these young African-American men who are buying steak while you're eating hamburger. So he has that story, he then in the State of the Union accesses it here. And he was right, I think. I think he's certainly picked up on something that the editors of The Onion also recognize to be true. So I thought this was one of the more prescient headlines that we've ever had. Right? This is the bulk of stories of people like, oh my God, why are they buying ho-hos? Why is she buying soda? As if somehow, because you don't have as much money as someone else, that you are supposed to live an ascetic life and have nothing sweet for sure, nothing that would bring any degree of enjoyment into your life. So, the personal witness stories. Here are a couple key characteristics, I would argue, when we stand back and we analyze them. One is that they're passive, right? So you're witnessing something else. The action's happening beyond you. Two, and I would argue this is one of the most important ones for the ideology, is that it sets up an immediate binary. It's us and them, right? It's observer and observed. It's, in some cases, maybe protagonist, because that's the good guy, and antagonist, and that's the aid recipient. But it sets up a divide just structurally by being a personal witness story. And the third is there is an assumption that what you're providing in a personal witness story is we're giving it to you face value, right? This is what I saw. You draw your own conclusions. I think we have to question that. I'm not so sure that we're not, in fact, and again, this won't come as a big surprise, but that we're filling in those gaps, right? What we see is a very incomplete slice of what's happening, right? We see somebody who maybe fits our idea of what somebody on public assistance looks like. They're buying something that you don't think they should be buying, a steak or crab legs or soda, and then you start this story, right? You've interpreted this as welfare. And it's powerful. Those filling in the gaps, I want to read to you this idea of a story behind the story. I want to read to you one of the quotes from one of the guys we worked with. He says, "It makes me want to go nuts, too, when I see those anchor babies supported by welfare mothers wearing manicured and pedicured nails, eating their breakfast at McDonald's every school morning, and prancing around with their own personal cell phone." So he said, and that's God, we can unpack that, the racial dimensions of that thing for from now to Kingdom Come, but we asked him and said, hey, you know, actually this is a guy that I talked to a few times because he had some things to say. And I said, well, how did you know they were on welfare? And he goes, well, of course they were on welfare. Look at what they looked like. I'm like, oh, okay, back it up. So he had no evidence at all that these people that he was seeing were receiving public assistance. But because that stereotype of the welfare queen and who gets it, he created a welfare story out of one that perhaps was not at all. So that filling in the gap, or filling in the blanks, we are filling it in with these sort of stereotypes and cultural values that are being perpetuated in the mass media, that are being perpetuated in much of the narrative tradition, certainly that we heard. This also happened with drugs. So we recorded 104 stories where people mentioned that aid recipients using drugs. In 74% of them, 71% of them, people actually said, I mean, I don't really know if that's what was going on, but probably. So they're actually even admitting that I'm adding this to the story, and this is a pretty classic example. This is Silas, not his real name. As far as welfare goes, I knew a white dude, sorry white dude, who was a friend of mine, who I worked with. And this guy was getting food stamps, had like 6 kids. And I guess he wanted drug money or something. I don't know what he wanted, but actually, and then he goes on to explain how he bought this guy's food stamps for 50 cents on the dollar. No evidence of drugs, yet all of a sudden we've now confirmed that aid recipients are drug users. So, not surprisingly, when we talk to aid recipients, the story behind the story was a little different. So, Tracy Rutherford, for example, she tells a story of buying steak from time to time. She does it 2 ways. 1, she does it when there's coupons and when there's meat's on sale. And 2, she barters for rides with one of her neighbors. She watches her kids from time to time, and barters for rides to go into a discount butcher and buy meat. Martina Morales, she has on occasion bought a birthday cake for her child, one from a grocery store. Of course, back to our Onion article, she should be making that cake, you know, and saving the extra $3.10 or whatever for the. But sometimes kids want stuff that has like a nice decoration. Sometimes kids want the store-bought cake. And so when she had enough money, she did that. Now, family are still bringing the soda and the hot dogs and the buns and providing the rest of the stuff for the party. But that's a story that you would never see at the grocery store, right? But that's the story behind the story. The last one is Lily Gibbs, hundreds of these, literally. But Lily Gibbs, you might see her buying dog food at the grocery store. She was in an abusive relationship. She left, barely with her life. In fact, her narrative is, chills, horrifying. She almost dies literally because she didn't realize she had diabetes, and she almost dies at a gas station as she's sort of fleeing. She gets kind of back up on her feet, and she adopts a stray dog. That dog is her emotional support dog and provides a psychological comfort that is worth billions in medical costs or aid. So, yeah, you might see somebody buying dog food with the little bit of cash they have. But there's more going on. And again, if we take the sort of themes that we unpack here, major illness, spousal abuse, child care problems, there's just a whole long litany of what brought people into the need for public assistance in the first place. So, I think if we stand back and we say the dominant stories are personal witness narratives, and we know they're setting up binaries, and we know we have incomplete information, and we know that the dominant stereotypes out there, because we've got the polls to do it, and if you want, we can look at some of the polls of where people, what they're saying about public assistance, it's really hard to get out from under that and tell a story of seeing somebody in the grocery store that's sympathetic. Ideally, and presumably, and theoretically, we could tell that story. But after 7 years of field work and over 1,200 narratives, we never heard anybody tell one. There is one example of a circulating legend of a guy, actually I'll share it if you want at some point. I don't know, it's going to take me too long maybe to unpack it, but it's made its rounds a lot. I mean, it's, Snopes has sort of unpacked it. It's a quaint story. It actually seems to have come from a guy who writes chicken soup for the soul books. He was a contributor to that, and then he has his own sort of spin-off series. And this story came right out of that. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's part of the story. The other part of the personal witness narrative is tied to the issue of narrative distance. And so, FOF, this is our most famous acronym, I think, in the field of folklore. We all, I think, accept the idea that when a story gets sort of too far away, we never wanted to lose track of, complete, give up the reins on the notion of credibility, that you might have a connection to the person it's happened to, and so we bring it a little closer, right? It's never more than 2 or 3 times away. And again, this part I've brought up in a previous AFS conversation, but I want to take it a step further. The question is, do we bring it even closer, right? Do we take somebody else's story and actually narrate it as our own? And I argue that we do, and we have some evidence for it. So in the 1970s, actually Linda Degg and Andrew Vajny coined, they call it 2 different things in different places. One, either a pseudo-memorat or a quasi-memorat. They don't spend particularly much time sort of unpacking it or theorizing about it, but mostly they are tapping into scholarship that sadly I can't access because of language barriers, but some of the European scholars have evidence of some of these kinds of moments. In the 1960s, Edgar Slotkin is talking to union workers and records them telling stories of various union efforts in their company, of stories that they position themselves as personally having witnessed that happened before they were born. In the 1980s, these great folklore projects that we send our students out to do, Adeline Johnson in the 1980s went to talk to her grandfather, and who tells this amazing story of his coworker who was working the late shift and went down into the sort of basement area and found a dead body. Super compelling. She went back because the professor said, get it, sort of a longitudinal, see if that, changes when you have different contexts. Great assignment. She goes back, reports it from him again, this time with her mom there as well, and now he's the one who saw the dead body. So again and again, and then Bill Ellis, he's done some great research, right? So his work on some of the animal mutilation stories in New York in the 1990s, just no evidence that there were those animal mutilations, but lots of folks saying, I definitely saw those things. Some people may have, and we just sort of miss that evidence, but clearly it seems people were shifting some of these stories into I saw it myself. People aren't making this shift if they're the protagonist. And this is where, again, the personal experience narrative, separating it from the personal witness narrative, is so important. So people aren't saying, I mutilated some animals in New York City, or I ate a big old dirty nasty fried rat, in a big old bucket of chicken. It was delicious. But they're saying they saw these kinds of things. So we can step into that role of observer. And so, again, we're kind of primed with the dominant narrative tradition here in the welfare stories for people to make that shift. Why do we care? We assume, and again, we'll be quick here, right? We assume that this is what happens generally. And when I say we, I mean folklorists are all much savvier than this, right? But we typically think, all right, there's this eyewitness story, and then we tell it secondhand, it's thirdhand, and then we kind of move into the sort of friend of a friend. The problem with ISIM, of course, is it's just replicating eyewitness stories. And then each one of these eyewitness stories could start their own pyramid, right? Why does that matter? It matters because the big debates around welfare are aren't the Linda Taylors of the world, that the guys working in that Mexican restaurant didn't exist. The debate is to what extent it's a problem. How widespread? So are there people who are doing immoral things and cheating the system? Yeah, in every walk of life, right? Not just in welfare. But we focus on this one space, and this doesn't help. All right, so the final piece of my talk is sort of this idea of a narrative solution. So this is where I kind of put my activist hat on a little bit. Narratives have caused some problems in how they're structured, but they also provide some great solutions, I think. So here's the question I want to ask. What should we do in the face of stereotypical welfare stories? Because we've all heard them. We've all been in those spaces. So, in many ways, my focus is on the do, right? The activism. But I want to at least explicate the we. There are things that we can do because of our positions of power and privilege that we have about providing access and platforms for people that we work with for them to share their own stories. So I'm not precluding that at all. In fact, there's some really interesting case studies of how people have established ways for aid recipients to work with politicians to change minds by sharing their personal stories directly. There's actually, I have some really compelling research too about who's listening to what story and what's kind of making its way past kind of all the roadblocks we put up when there's an ideological difference with what somebody tells us. But here I really want to talk about us. Us as folklorists, us as researchers, but also us as just people, right? Some of us in this room perhaps have used and maybe are continuing to use public assistance. Some folks will be lucky enough not to have done that. Some statistics suggest that 66% of all Americans either have been or know someone who has received public assistance at some point. So the we is just, if you don't have to have your folklore hat on, but you have your I'm a neighbor, I'm a human being, and I'm a sympathetic person hat. So unfortunately, the research, and this is really summarized down too, the research is kind of all over the place. So if we look at a lot of communications and marketing and rumor theory research, and a lot of that's coming, the rumor theory stuff is coming primarily from psychology, act fast and act aggressively, right? So these are these kinds of, when the rumors come out about Procter & Gamble, or about Church's Fried Chicken, or these kinds of things. A lot of the other psychology studies and memory studies say, if you repeat the false claim, you're going to lodge it in there. It's going to stick, and people won't remember that it's false. They're going to remember perhaps that it's true. So be really careful. In fact, shut up. Don't say anything. And then as folklorists, we know through a lot of our work in legend studies that those stories are going to exist, and we're going to continue to tell them as long as we are still afraid of them, as long as they are still sort of producing anxiety that we need to work through. So what do we do? So I want to start with what we don't do. Research suggests that we need to stay out of the negative register. So oftentimes we go this whole route of the top 10 myths about welfare, right? And we're like, poor people are lazy, and that's what's in big, broad font. And then the small font says, no, they're not. And here's some research that says they're not. Yeah, well, quit shouting the part that's not true. Again, lots of really interesting studies where even in 15 minutes, we've lost the knot. We've done some really interesting things with the CDC, and the vaccination issue continues, and there's a lot of work to be done in exactly this way. The he said, she said, right? So somebody tells you their story of, the terrible person who's defrauding the government, and you tell your story of the really happy, positive story of the person receiving public assistance, and oftentimes not much happens if it's just a he said, she said. So we have to be a little more strategic than just countering with a different narrative. Because great, you have your narrative, I have my narrative, we both go back to our own spaces. And if we actually bring confirmation bias and the backfire effect into this, and we can talk about that more, you'll probably be familiar with some of that work that's coming out of psychology, but it makes that even sort of more disturbing. We love pointing out the hypocrisy of demonizing welfare and then saying, but look at corporate welfare. The problem is it demonizes welfare, right? So we're continuing to say, yeah, so at the end of the day, nobody should be getting any help here. Well, that's not what we're saying, so maybe we should be careful with that story as well. And then statistics, and again, some fascinating studies about what happens when we use story to try to change minds and when we use statistics to try to change minds. And I actually noticed it's a poster, they're going to be talking about climate change. There's a woman here that's going to be coming here to speak about climate change, and she says, we need to do more than stats. Yeah, we need to tell better stories. Because that's, if you can move somebody into an empathetic frame of mind, you have a better chance of changing their minds. And that's what, then, if we go to sort of what does work. And so, empathy, coherence, immersion, and familiarity. What's the term? Active perspective taking. So, many of you will be familiar with a study that came out about transgender rights. And there's this big study that folks had gone door to door, and in 15 minutes, when transgender people spoke to just whoever answered the door, they were able to change their mind, not for a week, not for 2 weeks, but actually for, I think they sort of followed up in 6 months, because they sort of say, that's going to stick after 6 months, that they changed their minds. And people were like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And then they found out all that data was falsified. And so people were like, well, crap. But then the guy went back and said, but wait, that guy falsified data? But we do still have data. Let's actually take a look. And guess what? It was kind of right. They were able, when they got folks, to actually sort of step into a narrative where what they did was they asked, have you ever been in a situation where you have felt like you were discriminated against? So they got folks to empathize with them and said, that's what's happened to us. And that did seem to work. And it actually supports some other research out there as well. It wasn't as dramatic as the first study, but it still supported a lot of those major claims. Coherence, we can unpack Austin, who really talks a lot about the notion of different kinds of coherence of a narrative. It needs to be internal and external coherence. We need to be thinking about that when we tell our stories. And they need to be familiar. So I want to apply this in the last couple minutes here. I want to apply this concept to the folk tradition. So what I'm not suggesting is that we just make up stories, right, that fit our particular ideology, that we think are going to help win the day for what we feel is right. Rather, I'm saying, let's actually tap into the folk narrative tradition and share the stories in particular contexts that are going to be most effective. So these I'll spend almost no time on, but a couple of historical examples. In terms of slavery, abolitionists said, hey, the story we need to tell is how awful and cruel slavery is. People will be so horrified, they'll immediately outlaw this and we'll be fine. It didn't happen. People went farther into their corners until they started telling the story as a redemption narrative, as escaped slaves sort of moving from a state of non-grace to a state of grace. And by God, people understood Christian redemption narratives, and it started to shift. Of course, we had a civil war, so we didn't do enough, but it started to shift. In LGBTQ, and of course back here in the 1970s, really sort of LG, but in the LGBTQ community, we haven't gotten the rest of our sense of the breadth of sexual identity. But these narratives were often told as sexual deviance. We knew that narrative wasn't going to sort of win the day. But then when it was talked about sexual freedom, that sounds better, still didn't work. But when it shifted to issues of civil rights, when this was cast as a civil rights narrative, a familiar narrative that people understood, finally, at least politically, we know we still have a long way to go, but at least politically, it started to make some headway and change some minds. So here are the 4 stories that I would argue that we can find in the folk narrative tradition that we can kind of tap into, we can share, that will speak to some of the kinds of things that make a strategic narrative effective. When bad things happen to good people, it's 1978, Kushner publishes this book, right? All these folks who are good, but bad things still happen. Why? It was really a religious treatise, right? If there's a God, why is he crapping all over me when I go to church every Sunday? And so loads and loads and loads of these stories are people who were in marriages, and then their cheating husband left, and now they're stuck trying to care for 3 kids. They were good people. It was outside their control. Hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of things. Illness is the biggest, right? Where illness comes in and just waylays people. When your margin of error financially is, razor thin, you just don't have that kind of leeway. Redemption narratives, they also work here. This is particularly powerful for those stories of folks who among us is categorically a good person, right? a lot of us screw up. We're sinners. We make mistakes. So the redemption narrative, it certainly worked for George W. Bush, right? I mean, so we know politically that narrative can work. Now, that worked for a wealthy white guy, and that's a little different. But the idea of moving towards grace works. The question, and I don't have an answer for this, the question is, does that work if the person hasn't gotten to grace yet? If they're still on the road? And so this is like Mary Barker, pseudonym, who is still struggling with drug addiction. Why? Because when she checked herself into a clinic, she was threatened that she was going to lose her job. So she had to go back out. So the best way she could be a good mother to her children is to go back to work and continue to struggle with drug addiction alone. So she's in that, I think, gray area where I'm not quite sure where her story plays and how it works, but it's an important one. Structural injustice is one that we don't necessarily, I think, sort of in the kind of vernacular immediately go to, but what's useful about structural injustice is the idea that you're not pointing a finger at anybody, right? Redlining, you can point some fingers at, but for Michael Castor, who broke his leg and his form of transportation to get to his work, I mean, affordable housing was here, work was over here, he biked, and he hurt his leg, and he could almost not do the job anymore because he was standing up, he was a sort of a line cook at Arby's. He couldn't get there. So it's not somebody's inherent fault that he couldn't get there, right? Though you could say we should have better public transportation and things like that. But instead, there's this notion of equality that is just missing here, right? Structurally, it's not fair that he can't do what he needs to do, and yet we're going to demonize him for it. And then you've already heard me talk a little bit about the story behind the story. This is the big one. What this does, the story behind the story, actually takes, in all of these cases, right, we take a sort of a narrative frame and it fits kind of perfectly with the story that's being told. With the story behind the story, what's really happening is you're taking what people think is a familiar story. I know how this is going to end. But then it swerves at the end. It's a slightly more dangerous move because when you kind of pull the rug out from under somebody, they don't always respond particularly well. But if you can say, look, you know this story, you know how this works, you've seen the people in the grocery, but look what also is happening. So I think there's potential there too. Now, here's the final thing I want to leave you with. Rob Willer, a sociologist out in Stanford, basing a lot of his work on Graham Hayden Nozek, who are basing their work on lots of studies, specifically on the idea of moral foundation theory. And what they found is, after study after study after study, is that liberals tend to have these values. People who are self-identified as liberals. Conservatives tend to have these values. What he found was when he gave people opportunities to say, look, try to convince somebody that doesn't agree with you about climate change or whatever the piece was, only 8 to 9% of people tried to shift and use the moral values that they thought their audience had. Instead, what we do almost always is we think our moral values are right, and by gosh, if I just talk long enough, you'll see that too. It doesn't work. So, if we can tell stories, if we think about who our audience is and tell stories that tap into those ideologies, we might have more success in having them hear the story at all. Now, unfortunately, I would say the scale is still weighted against swaying conservatives. And the reason this is important is because politically, we know that in terms of support for the poor through public assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, etc., is that primarily Republican-run local governments and at the national level tend to favor cutting back on those programs. Democrats tend to favor providing more funding for those kinds of programs. So that's why sort of this is important, that we do speak to conservative people with conservative values. It's just that the stories align with liberal values just a lot more. And we can take each one and kind of talk about which ones do. But all is not lost. So the notion of purity, we can talk about kind of redemption, and we can talk about structural injustice as a move towards purity. Now, purity always gives me slightly a kind of a because it sounds like, well, it just sounds like white nationalist rhetoric, right? So we don't want that. But if we can tap into a kind of an idea of purity that's maybe more environmental, at least it's an ideology, maybe that works. And when bad things happen to good people, and the structural justice, this notion of authority, people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? They're following the letter of the law. They're trying to get jobs. They've got jobs and they're trying to save money. They're doing what's right and they're just not able to make it. So tapping into that dimension of the story, when we share stories about the people that if we don't know them, then buy this book and read a bunch of stories and you'll get some. I mean, the idea is that we do need to inform ourselves about the narratives that are out there. So I'm going to end with this, to say all is not lost. There is a chunk of my book where I do talk about memes. Memes are awesome in terms of people engaging with contemporary political discourse in really exciting ways. So actually I will read these. So picture of Jesus, right? Sorry, feeding you would be a waste of resources. I'm just not seeing the results. And then Jesus with Peter out in the water. No, Peter, I won't help you. That will only create dependency. Pick yourself up by your own sandal straps. It's called personal responsibility. And I share these not as, let's just Google and find some memes. These are memes I'm pulling from social media. And I would just, as a kind of a, I don't know, like my soapbox. I think when we do meme analysis, we can't just do those searches and say what pops up. It's, are people actually sharing these memes? Is it part of a vernacular tradition? And it was, and there's a lot more posts. I mean, there were 131 likes, there were 33 shares, but then when you follow the 33 shares, it kind of shares beyond that. So people are at least reading this a little bit. So I will stop there. That's actually not the cover of the book necessarily. It's a mock-up that I said, hey, what do you think? And they're like, maybe. So we'll see. But I'd love to address any questions that you have.
Tom will graciously take questions. Poor Elliot can't be here, so he can't do the first one, so someone else will have to.
I even have a slide with Elliot's face on here, ready for that moment, and I thought I wasn't coming, so. Marge.
Yeah, well, I wanted to alert you to a national program called Circles. Are you familiar with this? In Bloomington, it's called the SCAP Thriving Connections. And the way this works, I was involved for several years. People who are seeking to get out of poverty are matched, well, they match themselves with allies who are, people, sort of middle-class folks who and serve as allies, well, mentors, but it's deliberately framed as not to be a power differentiator. So the folks who are seeking to get out of poverty are come up with solutions themselves, but the ally might help somebody with an application to get into Ivy Tech, our local community college, might help people maneuver the system. And I was involved as a community ally for maybe 3 or 4 years. And if people were to, it is very time intensive. But in terms of negating some of those awful stereotypes, I truly ran across some very inspiring people. And I would, if you really want to do some good work, one-on-one, maybe one family at a time, check out SCAP Thriving Connections.
Thank you. That's great. And there are different cities, different programs for sure. I think one of the things that does, in terms of some of the literature of what's particularly helpful is in kind of Robert Putnam's terms of bridging and bonding social capital, we often find is that folks in lower socioeconomic status communities have a lot of bonding social capital, but not bridging social capital, and so establishing some of those relationships is great.
There were weekly dinners,
yeah.
and just all kinds of opportunities for.
Thank you. That's great. I appreciate that. Thanks so much. Please, Sandy.
I was really interested in the way you distinguish between the personal narrative and the personal witness narrative. I thought that was a really effective thing, and I'm wondering, in that chart where you had the two different ways that they disperse.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, I don't know, you don't need to get back to it, but
Yes.
I'm just do you have any sense of it changing, or over here on the ISIM?
Yeah.
Because I guess what I'm wondering is if that first articulation of it is the same in both cases, we kind of know how it changes over here,
Right.
but doesn't it change over here too?
You mean from the first eyewitness to the next sort of
Yeah.
eyewitness? So here's the trick. It's really hard to find evidence of this that you can actually compare, because most people like this. So the examples that we have, a guy started his interview and he was, he told a story. He said, I know this couple, I used to see him every day, and he really describes the situation quite clearly. And then later in the interview, as he's warmed up and he's maybe a little more comfortable with us, he said, I said, actually, I was there. I was leaving the interview, and I said, I just wondered about that couple. And he goes, yeah. I said, well, what were some of the specifics? Did you live beside them? They're like, well, it's somebody my wife knew. And then I said, oh. And he said, yeah, she knew about them from somebody. So it got really far away. But that's super rare for us to find that. So it's hard for us to know what two stories we're comparing. What is true is you can't distinguish them. So with all of our I saw it myself, I can't tell you which one is and which one isn't. There wasn't, first of all, because I don't know, I wouldn't have a control group, but yeah, it's a good question. I just don't know how we'd answer it. Yeah. Please.
I'm not sure what to do with this, but you probably will, because this is what popped into my head when you were recounting the story of the woman buying dog food with food stamps.
Yeah.
The counter-narrative that popped into my head was, well, it turns out she's buying the dog food because it's the best way to stretch the dollar and she plans to eat it. Because that was the story that was told about, old people,
Yeah.
retirees, that
Right.
before we had Social Security.
Well, and Diane and I over lunch one AFS, you worked at a grocery store and tell us exactly the story.
Yeah, and it was someone who had no teeth. And the
Uh-huh.
alternative was baby food
Uh-huh.
or dog food.
Dog food is cheaper.
Yeah.
It had more nutrients in it.
Right. But outlawed. So not part of what you can use your food stamps on. So yes, that might be a piece of why people were trying to do it.
Because
Which is interesting.
that story about the seniors who was so poor that they had to buy dog food, everyone has sympathy
Right.
for that story.
Right. Yeah, and what's tricky is that that's not who they place in that spot. They don't place the old senior. They place the long fingernail, hair weave,
Yeah.
designer clothing person into that spot. And once that is your image, it's hard to shift them over. But yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. Thanks, Jessica.
I've never thought of this before until this talk, and so I'd be curious to see what you would do with this in a fieldwork situation, but the extreme couponing and the coupon queen, that's a similar take advantage of the system, but it's all for good, it's a Robin Hood kind of story. And then you take all of your bounty and you take it to the women's shelter and leave it there. But it's still kind of milking a system, but the system is not the government, the system is, CBS, corporate giants. And so it'd be interesting to kind of see, and the demographics of who gets told those kind of stories about.
Sure. Well, that's a huge piece of, who are you putting there? The other piece, I think, is what,
Was that you, Sir Terry?
I was just,
the super couponing? Yeah, definitely, Yeah.
it's not just that I saw it myself.
Yeah, I did it myself. See? So no, absolutely people are doing that. What's interesting is there doesn't seem to be a rational line between how people are deciding what is acceptable forms of getting back at the man and what's not. And so if you do it, it's acceptable. If you don't, then it's unacceptable. And a piece of that kind of notion is when we just look at what's included in welfare and what's not. So when it's the check and when it's food stamps, it's unacceptable. When it's SSI or SDI or some of these other ones, no, that's needed. That's, because I'm on that. And Medicaid is needed, and Social Security is needed. And so there's not a clear, rational spot there. But how people are justifying it, absolutely. Please.
And is that where
just in terms of your method, it starts, it's like, tell me your story about welfare.
Yeah.
And does
Yeah.
that matter if you do things like, tell me about poverty, tell me about poor people?
Yeah.
You
So.
get different stories.
No, it's great. So because it was this big project, we had lots of different people sort of out in the field doing data collection, we had to kind of have a pretty clear sort of approach to what questions were to be asked. And it was, for aid recipients, it was, the first question is, can you just tell me a little bit about your life? Big, grand tour, wide open question. And then the key was, you follow them where they take it. And so, yes, at a certain point, people were asked, do you have a sense of how Americans view public assistance and welfare? And then that was the sort of the transition into the kinds of those stories. But, and I should have actually mentioned this, when I was kind of giving you, I said, here are the personal witness narratives, and then here the sort of story behind the story of people who are actually experiencing it. Those were not prompts of, do you know about fraud? They were prompts of, how do you make ends meet? And that's where those stories, so yes, we're always going to put ourselves, right, in a positive light, or a more positive light, or almost always. But those stories were emerging not in this kind of, I need to defend myself against fraud. But that's a huge piece of, right, is what was the performance context in these interviews and how did we get there? And we tried to be as open-ended as possible and say, tell me about the experiences you have. And it was, so, most people just took that and ran, mostly with poverty, but then talked about the aid they got.
I'm interested in particularly the people that you're saying were not.
Oh, that's not aid recipients? Yeah, so that's where we started with, and said we're doing a project, we're trying to understand how people perceive public assistance and welfare in America. We wondered what your thoughts were. That's how those were phrased. Yeah. Diane?
This is picking up on what you were just saying. The narratives that you were telling us here, I noticed that the ones that were the welfare theme narratives, you actually read like they were real narratives. The ones that were not, the ones that were from the people themselves who were on welfare, you referred to. But you didn't actually tell the narrative. That's not all. So
That's good. Yeah.
But I think that I'm guessing just from your other work that that's because those narratives are incredibly long.
Yes.
And that's partially because of the way you collected them. But
Maybe
what
there's
that
trauma
means,
there, but yeah.
what that means is that they're not punchy to put out there.
And so let me get back to that point. So you're exactly right, and it's why I tried to sort of frame and say, look, most of this work and the collaboration that we developed was about getting those stories out there. For this audience, I thought this work on more of the legend stuff made more sense to unpack in terms of some of the kind of theorizing I was doing. But you're exactly right, and that's a huge piece of what we have to do when we do kind of share these stories. The biggest thing we can do is to provide platforms, right, so people can tell their own stories. But they're not neat and tidy. So in the 1990s, right when the Welfare Act is sort of being debated through Congress, there was an effort by, it was a Jewish foundation in Chicago that was basically training aid recipients in storytelling techniques to tell tight, concise stories that would work. Sounds kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think we all are like, oh, hi, I don't know, right? We like the idea that they might break through and be nice and tidy, but we hate the idea that they're being coached and being told how their story has to be told. The most effective way is there was this program called Walk a Mile, and they paired, and I was thinking actually Marge was going in that direction, but they paired aid recipients with politicians who were debating, this was local government, who were debating whether they were going to fund some of the social programming with politicians who had very clearly said, I'm not in favor. And they told their stories while walking a 5K for charity. And in that time, there was time for them to share a story with this sort of leisure of not having this, because they were doing something together. And so it actually provided a context that was conducive to the way people were actually telling stories. So I think we have to do some of that. Yeah, it's a big problem. And that's where I kind of go back to, if you're the ones telling the story, and that's why I said, if we wanted to be clear about who the we is, if we do want to do any of that work and step in and not pull out a tape recorder and try to play somebody's narrative or hand them something published and written, then we are going to have to figure out ethical and good ways to tell those stories. But it's folklore, and this is actually what I'm going to be talking about at AFS in October. how do we sort of establish some of these other places and positions to allow those stories to be told as written? It's also where the book comes in, right? So they're there. You can take the time to read them. We are used to spending time with texts, and we are willing to read other people's stories in text form. I don't know if that fully answers, but yeah. And it's such a good point about kind of how I'm navigating the kind of balance of whose voice. And unfortunately, I was definitely favoring the legend voice over the recipient voice. Yeah.
We're just watching the audience, so Sue had a question, but also Kelly, and then Jesse, and I think Mary also has a question. But I think it can win in that sort of that order.
So actually, yeah, okay.
He's got an interesting way of memorizing things. Unfortunately, I did not take notes, which I usually do, but I didn't take notes. So I want to go back to the term welfare, because you call people aid recipients, and I'm sure that's incredibly intentional. So when people, a lot of the time was spent on what, didn't you call these welfare stories? Isn't that a genre that you called it? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I use both. And part of it is, well, I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, the point is, so welfare stories has one connotation in my mind, and I assume far different in other, because I never hear of these stories. That's just people love telling these stories. Versus an AIDS story. So what you're labeling the genre and putting into that category, I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah. So I went back and forth a lot about this, and in other articles and things. This is always a conversation I have with the editors. Part of it's reclaiming the language, that we know welfare is used, and that's what people recognize. Oftentimes when I say public assistance, people don't know what I'm talking about. Welfare, they do. What does welfare mean? It's really good, right? The welfare of children, when we have that context, we're like, yes, I'm in favor of the welfare for children, but we're not when we talk about it as a social program. So part of it is trying to reclaim some of the language, but it's dangerous. And it's why I use aid recipient when I'm talking about people. But when I'm trying to signal the topic for you to sort of enter into the space, I do often use welfare as a way to try to sort of, as a kind of a recognition moment. I don't think I can rehabilitate the term alone, but I think there's an effort to try. A lot of the folks that I worked with, they use welfare. That's what the term they use. I also sort of want to honor some of that. But it's hard. And that's why I use both, partly because so that we're always thinking about how we're positioning these kinds of things. Yeah, it's a good question.
Kelly?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could speak to the place of race and racism in your larger analysis, because it comes up in the quotes, but it seemed a little bit backgrounded in some of the discussion.
Yeah.
And even when we're talking about coupon versus welfare, to me that seems like a racialized discourse. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that in the larger context of the full research.
Yeah. So there's really no way to kind of address this topic without recognizing how deeply racialized welfare is. And in fact, if you just a little glimpse of the history of our perceptions of public assistance, it's the moment, thanks to civil rights, the moment in the 1960s and 70s when African American people actually now start having access to this money, because they didn't before. It was mostly for sort of white women and families. And so the moment, civil rights is great, but the moment that happens and the roles start populating with people of color is the moment that racial animus gets dropped right on top of welfare, and it becomes racialized ever since. And that's James Marie Hancock's argument, it's Gillen's argument, it's kind of everybody's argument. That's a piece. In terms of the stories, so a big chunk of what I've done is sort of take a look at so dog whistling, happens throughout the political discourse here, right? That people are sort of saying urban and they mean black, or they're saying states' rights and they mean, let's try to keep voter suppression, et cetera. And so if you pay it, so that's what I do in the book, is I try to unpack kind of what are some of the images that are recycled, and hair weaves, right? Pedicured and manicured nails, designer handbags. And you think, designer handbag, why is that racialized? But it is. And so I'm looking at the kind of symbols, and my God, the welfare Cadillac, right? So I unpack the history kind of the Cadillac and how that becomes racialized, because when the Cadillac was released, black people were not allowed to buy said, we will not sell this car to African Americans. So it became a symbol for wealthy African Americans to get a white friend to buy that car for them. And then that's how some of this kind of thing works. So yeah, it's deeply enmeshed, and we could kind of go in, I think, a lot of different directions. I don't know if that sort of answers some of it.
Yeah, I guess it seemed like a little bit in the discussion, I think using hair weave to gloss race
Yeah.
instead of naming the race. So I was wondering if maybe we were doing that a little bit ourselves in the discussion we were having, and I wanted to bring that up as.
You mean that the discussion we're having right now isn't, like we're steering clear of the issue of race? Or?
Not necessarily in terms of content, but I was just wondering if in our own language we were repeating some of that.
Well, the stories certainly do. We, and I'm analyzing the stories, and so, to get at that, we have to kind of talk about some of it. But yeah, no, if you're catching yourself telling stories with those motifs, yeah, you're absolutely perpetuating a racial stereotype for sure. And we could do some more with kind of this notion of couponing, et cetera. It wasn't a big piece of kind of the work that we did, but yeah, thanks.
I just want to clarify, when I'm talking about couponing, I'm talking about clipping the Sunday paper. Is that,
Yeah.
am I,
That's what I was talking
I
about.
want to make
I
sure
thought it
that
was
we're not talking about the welfare coupons.
Right.
Which is also
Food
a
stamp
thing.
coupons, yeah.
Right, but the.
Which don't exist anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Right,
No,
yeah,
not
and
Right.
just to clarify that, because there is this whole, I think, probably genre around that activity
Yeah.
as, and probably racialized in very different ways, and that's the point.
Or genderized for sure.
And certainly genderized.
Certainly.
And
Yeah.
maybe age.
Right. But yeah, but
Yeah.
when you see a white person doing it, is it seen as, yeah, that's effective, and when you see an African American person doing it, it's one more way of gaming the system. Right. How are we interpreting that through racial lens? Absolutely.
Let me break in to say one thing. I know that Jesse's got a question and Meredith's got a question, and other people may have a question too. We're coming up to 7:30. We don't have to leave at 7:30. I know we're all having fun, but one thing I forgot to mention is that across the street, we've got a reception. And we can continue talking to Tom. He's going to be here all week, and in fact, the grad students also get a chance to ask any question you didn't get a chance to or didn't feel like you wanted to ask. So just know that that's happening. But Jesse, you're on.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I really appreciated you framing sort of like a proactive stance at the end of your talk about ways that we can utilize these stories strategically. And I'm thinking back on my personal experiences with people, and I know that a lot of your fieldwork was with people who are aid providers, right? People who work within the system, but still continue to share or internalize many of these sort of stereotypical narratives. And I have this semester been talking to my students a little bit about disaster humor, probably in an internet power class, and the way that we respond to like trauma and anxiety by creating that distance intentionally. So for example, my partner works in law enforcement, and he will tell me stories because he's been working in the area with a lot of homeless people that are profoundly stereotypical, right? But those are based on his personal experiences.
Yeah.
But I'm also positive that he's framing those narratives in a way that that creates distance between him and those people in order for him to be able to continue to do his job. So I'm wondering about what to do when you're wanting to use those narratives strategically, but you're also speaking with somebody who, in their day-to-day life, is intentionally creating that distance to reduce some anxiety.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is, kind of back to that he said, she said, is, and this idea that, yes, there are people who are doing things that would, frustrate us and seem wrong or inappropriate or immoral. We're not going to, you don't want to position yourself to say, yeah, but your experience doesn't matter, right? Yeah, we've heard that story before. It's got legendary motifs and so on. We don't want to get into that space. What I found useful is asking the question, because even people who are saying like so many and all whatever, you say, well, is it most of the folks that you're working with? I mean, on any given night, is it like, well, no, it's not, And so just reminding folks of the kind of idea of putting in that larger context of just reflecting back, because we do remember those negative. And when we talk to a lot of aid providers, we say, well, who are you telling these stories to? Well, they're telling them to each other as kind of stress relief, and they're telling them at home to vent about a hard day. Because it's hard to work with somebody that you think is sort of self-sabotaging or doing whatever. Yeah. In In terms of the move that you're talking about, a conscious kind of distancing move, yeah, and I think acknowledging that, right? This isn't perfect, and I think the minute we try to paint one group as saints, that's why the redemption narrative I think is so important. It's like we're not dealing with saints here. They're you and me. We're not saints. They're not saints. But how can we move forward in a way that's productive? Yeah, that's a great point.
Meredith. And Nina, I know you've got your hand up, and maybe I'll call yours the last question. Okay.
So I was kind of thinking through some of this when you were talking with Diane about the fact that these are not really concise narratives. A lot of times they're difficult to figure out how to present to an audience who maybe really needs to hear them. And I was curious, narrative isn't the only form. And have you looked at or studied any of the other initiatives that might be out there that are doing this through material culture, through visuals, through other forms?
Yeah, so we actually, one of the 10 outcomes was a photo exhibit. It was called Portraits of Hope. It's modeled off of a model that in Chicago, I think, has been pretty successful. And so we had some of our best photographers and some local folks take these really stunning kind of black and white photos. And so, yeah, so through images, and those were cases where people were willing to kind of put their face out there, put their first name out there, and many of them their last name too, but you know, informed consent and risk is really hard sometimes to navigate when you're shifting from a context that people sort of understand and know into a context that is unfamiliar. So we were navigating that a lot. So yeah, we did certainly explore that. There's a documentary called American Winter that came out a couple of years ago that is really, it's following the sort of economic depression, and it's mostly working with people who were leading middle-class lives or who were doing fine, and then economic depression came along and then boom. So it's sort of more like, oh, they're already so sympathetic because they were fine and they were here and they were like us. And they're not, you know, it doesn't do, I think, enough to deal with folks who are in cycles of poverty, who just cannot get up and out. Because, I mean, we could spend all month talking about the structural things in place with the policy that mean you are not getting out of poverty with the public assistance the way it's set up right now. It is there to keep you barely existing. So, yeah, we have a website where you can click and you can hear, now that story again, but there's some images and things like that. So a little bit. And I also am certainly looking at memes and how people are using memes to try to kind of engage this kind of discourse. So, yeah.
Sorry, a little bit of an additional, anything that actually has the recipients using other forms to tell their own stories.
Well, in the exhibit, everybody put one thing of their own to go into the exhibit. So there's an image, there's a short bio, there's a story, and then like Pat Wilson, for example, knits, and that's how she makes some extra income. So she makes a lot of money on SpongeBob SquarePants, little hoodie or hat things with little straps. And so that was what she chose. Another family had a beloved family dog, and they had a plaque made for the dog, and that, you know, so some of those kinds of efforts. Photo voice is a pretty common way that people have done that. I haven't used that as a methodology, but yeah, no, it's great to think about. And again, the more we can do that put us back in people's hands, it's a different story. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, you're for a non-folklorist, your analysis is fascinating.
You call me a non-folklorist?
No.
Oh gosh, sorry, just like not a fire on my part. I get it. Okay.
That's what happens with banging corners. Okay, so the question I want to ask is, part of your strategy seems to be making them become more precise. Like, how many people have you seen doing that, and were they an outlier, were they typical? But it seems to me that one of the most basic precisions, and I'm wondering if you attack this or whether they are aware of it, is what is the motivation for their story? Is it they hate all of public assistance, or they hate the cheaters of public assistance? And do they ever acknowledge that, well, actually, I really think public assistance is essential and I'm primary, but I hate cheaters? I mean, do they ever make that division, or is it?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, even kind of on a sort of macro level, when you look at polls about how Americans view various things, like everybody loves the poor, right? We all are in favor of helping the poor, but we all hate the way we do it. And I would say it's a cop-out that if we really did this, we would actually be okay with some of the ways that we might engage. So I think there's some, I don't think we're being honest with ourselves. No, I think it's really hard can you imagine telling somebody like, God, there's some serious racial overtones to what you just conversations and kind of rethink, and I don't know that from our follow-up conversations. I don't see those, and that's part of what we weren't, I mean, to be very clear, that we weren't in talking to folks, that wasn't our goal at all. It was just, let's hear kind of what's there, and then let's see what's actually being said underneath. So, yeah, it's a good point. But
Well, as I say, the conversation doesn't have to end, but maybe we